My friend's mom wasn't just taking my measurements, she was measuring my heart. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the lace curtains as I stepped up to the familiar house of my friend, Jake. I'd come to pick up a shirt he had left for repairs, but I hadn't anticipated the flutter of nerves that accompanied the thought of seeing his mother. She was a woman I'd always admired from afar, confident, graceful, and effortlessly magnetic, though I'd never thought of her in any way beyond respect, until now. The door opened before I could knock, and there she stood, her presence filling the doorway with a calm authority. She wore a soft, tailored blouse, her hair loosely pinned back, a few elegant strands curling around her face. There was a quiet elegance to the way she moved, the kind of grace that made every gesture look effortless yet meaningful. She greeted me with a warm, knowing smile, and for a fleeting second, I felt exposed under the steady gaze of her dark, observant eyes. "Ah, you're here for the shirt," she said, her voice smooth and comforting, yet tinged with curiosity, as if she were already trying to read me. "Come in. I'll need to measure more than just your size." I stepped into the living room, which smelled faintly of lavender and sewing oils. Rolls of fabric leaned against the walls, sunlight catching the soft textures in a way that made everything feel alive. Mannequins stood silently in corners, draped in half-finished dresses and jackets, each one whispering the story of her meticulous hands. She moved among them with quiet precision, picking up pins, adjusting fabric, humming softly to herself, yet somehow fully aware of my presence in the room. As I approached, she handed me the measuring tape, her fingers brushing mine briefly. The contact was subtle but electric, a warmth that seemed to linger longer than it should. I caught myself noticing the gentle way she carried herself, the small tilt of her head as she examined a hem, the smooth flow of her movements as she adjusted a piece of fabric. It was impossible not to be drawn in, not just by her beauty, but by the calm authority and warmth she radiated. We exchanged casual words while she prepared the shirt, but beneath the polite conversation, I could feel an undercurrent of tension I didn't fully understand. The sound of scissors snipping and fabric rustling created a private rhythm, a small cocoon where the world outside seemed to disappear. My heart was quietly alert, noticing every subtle motion, every glance that lingered just a moment too long. Even in these first few minutes, I realized this visit would be unlike any other. It wasn't just a shirt she was measuring, it felt like she was somehow measuring the space between us, and I was more than aware of how close I'll need to measure more than just your size, she said with a playful glint in her eyes, and I felt my stomach tighten. I tried to play it cool, but the faint smile tugging at the corners of my lips betrayed me. The measuring tape felt surprisingly heavy in my hands, though I knew it was nothing more than simple cotton. She gestured for me to stand upright, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, and for a moment, I was acutely aware of how exposed I felt under her watchful gaze. Her eyes traced the line of my shoulders, the curve of my back, and the subtle tension in my arms. Every movement was precise, purposeful, yet there was a softness in the way she moved around me that made my pulse quicken. As she stepped closer to measure my chest, I could feel the faint warmth of her body nearby. The measuring tape brushed lightly against my shoulder, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. She adjusted the tape with careful fingers, and in the process, our hands brushed briefly, an innocent touch, yet it lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, a soft floral note that made my thoughts scatter in ways I wasn't prepared to admit. Then, she moved behind me to check my back length, her fingers tracing lightly over the fabric of my shirt. I froze for just a moment, aware of the closeness and the way the world seemed to narrow down to the two of us. Her touch was delicate but confident, as if she knew exactly how to gauge the right measurement while unintentionally leaving me unsettled. My mind raced, questioning why a simple act of tailoring felt suddenly so intimate. Her voice, calm and instructive, guided me through small adjustments: stand a little straighter, tilt your shoulders slightly, and each instruction brought her subtly closer. I noticed how her hair caught the sunlight, the soft curl brushing the nape of her neck, and I couldn't help but feel both captivated and hesitant. I tried to focus on the shirt, on the measurements, but every glance in the mirror reminded me that she was not just measuring fabric, she was measuring the space between us, the way I reacted to her presence. Even the smallest gestures carried weight, the way she smoothed the fabric, the quiet hum of her voice, the almost imperceptible glance that lingered just a moment too long. My chest tightened, my senses sharpened, and I realized that what should have been a mundane task had become an unspoken dance of proximity, subtle curiosity, and quiet tension. By the time she stepped back to assess the tape's markings, I found myself both relieved and disappointed. There was a magnetic pull in that brief closeness, one I couldn't yet name, but already, I knew the day's visit would leave a lingering warmth in my mind long after I walked out the door. After the initial measurements, the atmosphere between us shifted subtly, from the electric tension of closeness to a gentler, more intimate rhythm. She moved around the room, draping fabric over mannequins, snipping threads with practiced ease, while I watched quietly, holding the newly measured shirt in my hands. It was mundane work, yet every motion she made seemed charged with a quiet energy, as if the sunlight streaming through the windows paused to linger on her hair, on the curve of her shoulders, on the careful way her fingers traced the fabric. "Do you come here often?" she asked, not looking up as she adjusted a hem, her voice soft and playful. I laughed lightly, nervous, and shook my head. "Only when Jake needs a favor. Though I can see why he trusts you with his wardrobe." Her gaze finally met mine, and there was a spark of warmth in her eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that this wasn't just a casual comment. She smiled, and the kind of smile that crinkles the corners of the eyes and carries a hint of vulnerability. It made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't used to. As she worked, we began to talk about other things, small, everyday details that felt oddly intimate in the quiet of her studio. The faint hum of her sewing machine provided a soothing background rhythm, punctuated by the soft snip of scissors or the rustle of fabric. We talked about favorite books, movies, the oddities of life in a small town. She shared anecdotes with a dry humor that made me grin, and I noticed how her eyes lit up when she recalled a memory, a softness that contrasted beautifully with her confident demeanor. Every so often, our hands brushed while passing scissors or adjusting the shirt. Each touch was fleeting but left a lingering warmth that made me painfully aware of the space between us. Her presence seemed to fill the room, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, magnetic pull that made it impossible to think about anything else. I found myself drawn to the subtleties, the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her fingers brushed against fabric with delicate precision, the faint floral scent she carried. Even when she wasn't speaking to me, I felt an unspoken connection, a sense that we were inhabiting the same small universe, just a few steps apart. By the time the conversation lulled, I realized something had shifted. The room no longer felt like a simple workshop, it felt like a space suspended between reality and something else, something unspoken, something warm. And in that quiet, I became acutely aware that this was more than casual conversation. It was the first thread of connection, woven carefully, quietly, and irrevocably between us. The soft afternoon light had shifted to a warmer, golden hue by the time she paused in her work, holding a delicate piece of fabric against a mannequin. There was a quiet gravity in her expression, a fleeting tension around her eyes that made me hesitate, unsure whether to break the silence or wait. For the first time, the confident, graceful woman I had admired from afar seemed human, vulnerable, and beautifully so. "I suppose everyone has regrets," she said suddenly, her voice low, almost a whisper as she traced the hemline with careful fingers. "Little things you wish you'd done differently. Or big things. Life has a funny way of reminding you that some moments can't be reclaimed." I froze slightly, not out of discomfort but because the space between us seemed to shrink in that moment. The air felt warmer, heavier, as if it too had been drawn into the weight of her words. I wanted to say something, anything, but the right words didn't exist. So I simply nodded, letting her continue, letting the room and its soft sounds cradle the conversation. She gestured toward a section of fabric, inviting me to hold it as she demonstrated a subtle stitching technique. Our hands met over the cloth, her fingers guiding mine with gentle precision. The contact was fleeting but intimate, and I felt the warmth of her hand linger longer than necessary, like a quiet reassurance. Her proximity was intoxicating, not in a way that made me flustered, but in a way that made every small detail, the tilt of her head, the soft hum of her voice, the curve of her shoulder, impossible to ignore. As she spoke, she shared a story about her late husband, a memory tinged with both humor and sadness. Her eyes softened, gaze lingering on a distant corner of the room, and I realized she trusted me enough to reveal pieces of her heart she rarely shared. The vulnerability in her voice, the subtle trembling of her fingers as she adjusted the fabric, stirred something unexpected in me, protective, tender feeling that went beyond admiration. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet brush of her sleeve against my arm, the way her presence seemed to fill the space with warmth. For a moment, I simply stood there, holding the fabric, letting the shared silence stretch between us. It was a moment unhurried, delicate, and intimate, not a touch too bold, but one that lingered in a way words could never capture. When she finally stepped back and smiled softly, it was not the confident, self-assured smile from before, it was softer, more human. I felt a subtle shift between us, a quiet acknowledgement that something unspoken had begun to grow. The air seemed charged, yet comfortable, a slow-burning intimacy that hinted at connection, trust, and perhaps, something more. In that golden light, surrounded by fabric and the quiet rhythm of her work, I understood, this wasn't just about tailoring shirts anymore. This was about measuring something far more delicate, heartbeats, glances, unspoken emotions, one careful, tender moment at a time. By the time the fitting was nearly complete, the quiet rhythm of the room had settled into something almost sacred. The soft hum of the sewing machine, the occasional snip of scissors, and the gentle rustle of fabric created a private soundtrack, one that seemed to exist only for us. I held the shirt in my hands, observing her as she moved with her usual grace, but there was a subtle shift, an awareness, a pull, in the space between us that had grown heavier with every brush of hands, every glance in the mirror. She stepped close to adjust the shoulder seam, her fingers brushing lightly against the collar. The contact was fleeting, accidental, she would have claimed, but it sent a quiet thrill up my arm. I felt the warmth of her body nearby, and the faint scent of her perfume seemed stronger somehow, mingling with the gentle lavender of the room. Our reflections in the mirror caught my eye, she leaned slightly forward, the curve of her neck catching the light, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not just a skilled tailor, but someone achingly human, delicate, and mesmerizing. Her voice broke the silence, soft and careful, as she guided me through minor adjustments. Tilt your head just a little, perfect. Hold still there. There was no hurry, no forced tension, yet every instruction, every proximity felt charged with an intimacy neither of us spoke aloud. I could feel the subtle weight of her presence pressing against the air between us, a gentle tension that made my heart beat louder in the quiet room. At one point, our hands met again while smoothing out the fabric, lingering for an imperceptible beat longer than necessary. I could sense her awareness of it, the faint lift of her gaze toward mine, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The moment was electric and terrifyingly delicate, like the fragile pause between two heartbeats, suspended in time. Even the smallest details became magnified, the tilt of her head as she examined the fit, the soft hum as she concentrated, the way her sleeve brushed ever so slightly against my arm. Each movement pulled me further into a quiet orbit around her, a magnetic field of unspoken curiosity and desire, tempered by respect and hesitation. When she finally stepped back to assess the shirt, our eyes met in the mirror, holding a long, silent look. No words were spoken, yet the air between us seemed to thrum with possibility. In that room filled with fabric, sunlight, and quiet motion, the mundane act of fitting a shirt had transformed into something far more intimate, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of connection, tension, and something that neither of us fully dared to name, but both of us felt. By the time I left the mirror, I knew this day would linger in my mind, not because of the shirt, but because of her, her presence, and the invisible thread that had woven itself quietly between us. The final adjustments to the shirt were almost complete, but the room no longer felt like a simple workshop. The air between us had thickened with unspoken words, small touches, and lingering glances, creating a tension that was both intoxicating and delicate. She leaned closer to smooth a fold in the fabric, her fingers brushing my wrist as she did so. The touch was light, but it lingered, intentional or not, I couldn't tell. My pulse jumped at the warmth of her skin, the soft weight of her presence, the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You're surprisingly attentive," she said softly, almost hesitantly, as if testing the waters. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, catching mine with a quiet intensity that made me falter. There was a vulnerability there, subtle and fleeting, beneath the confident exterior I'd always admired. Most people don't notice the little things, the details that actually matter. I swallowed, my throat dry, and replied sincerely, I notice you. You make it hard not to." The words were simple, but they carried more than admiration, they carried acknowledgement, longing, and the quiet awareness that the space between us was no longer just physical. She stepped back slightly, letting go of the fabric, yet her gaze remained fixed on me. There was a pause, long enough that the room seemed to hold its breath. I noticed the faint sparkle in her eyes, a mixture of amusement, warmth, and something deeper, a subtle invitation that neither of us named but both recognized. Her hand rested briefly on my wrist as she handed me the finished shirt, a touch that lingered for just a beat longer than necessary. I felt a quiet shiver of connection, an awareness of her closeness, and the unspoken energy flowing between us. The hum of the sewing machine, the rustle of fabric, even the sunlight filtering through the curtain seemed to slow down, giving space to the weight of the moment. "I suppose," she said finally, with a soft, almost teasing smile, "some measurements can't be taken with a tape alone." The words were light, but layered, carrying a subtle confession wrapped in humor. My chest tightened as I realized she was speaking to more than the shirt, she was speaking to the tension, the curiosity, the attraction that had been building silently between us. In that quiet room, surrounded by fabric, sunlight, and the faint scent of her perfume, I understood that something had shifted irrevocably. We hadn't rushed, we hadn't spoken the full truth aloud, yet the acknowledgement hung in the air, a delicate, fragile promise of desire, attention, and a connection that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. By the time I adjusted the collar in the mirror, I knew it, this wasn't just a shirt. It was the first thread of something far deeper, woven silently, beautifully, and undeniably between us. The fitting was finally complete. The shirt hung perfectly, each seam and fold a testament to her meticulous hands. Yet, as much as the garment impressed me, it was the quiet, lingering moments between us that left the deepest impression. The soft hum of the sewing machine had slowed to a gentle murmur, and the afternoon sunlight had softened into a warm golden glow, casting long shadows across the room. She stepped closer to adjust the collar one last time, her fingers brushing lightly against my chest. The contact was subtle, but it carried the weight of unspoken words, of curiosity, of quiet desire restrained by respect. I felt the warmth of her hand linger, a heartbeat that seemed suspended in time. I caught the faint scent of her perfume mixed with lavender, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Our eyes met in the mirror, and there was a long, wordless conversation in that gaze. No words were necessary, the look conveyed trust, acknowledgement, and the gentle recognition of a connection that neither of us could, and didn't want to, ignore. I noticed the faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, softer than the confident grin I had seen before, revealing a vulnerability and warmth that made my chest ache in the most unfamiliar yet comforting way. "I'll see you soon, won't I?" I asked softly, trying to keep my voice steady, though it carried the weight of the emotions building inside me. She nodded, her eyes holding mine with a quiet intensity. "Soon," she replied, her tone gentle but deliberate, as if making a promise without speaking it aloud. The room felt suspended in that single, perfect moment, an intimate space where nothing existed beyond the two of us. I straightened the shirt on my shoulders, feeling the craftsmanship against my skin, but also feeling the invisible thread between us, woven from glances, fleeting touches, and the quiet vulnerability she had shared. I realized that this visit, simple as it seemed on the surface, had transformed something ordinary into a memory that would linger in my mind, in my heart. As I walked toward the door, she stepped forward, our fingers brushing one last time in the hallway. It was light, almost accidental, yet it carried warmth, reassurance, and a promise of more. I paused, turning back for a final glance. Her silhouette framed by the soft sunlight, graceful and confident yet tender in a way that made me ache, was etched in my memory. The door closed softly behind me, leaving me outside with the hum of the street, the fading sunlight, and a quiet, persistent warmth in my chest. I knew this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The subtle tension, the silent attraction, and the emotional connection we had cultivated would grow, quietly and irresistibly. And for the first time, I looked forward to seeing her again, not just for the shirt, but for the moments that had already begun to bind us together. As I walked away, my mind replayed every glance, every fleeting touch, and I couldn't help but wonder what might happen the next time I returned. If you enjoyed this slow burn story of subtle desire and quiet connections, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this age gap romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection so strong it lingered long after a simple encounter?